Hello and welcome to the audio commentary for Sweeney 2, the second of 3 theatrically released films based on the 1970s British police drama. I am film critic Simon Abrams, and I be talking to you throughout, for which I apologize. Hopefully, if you have this Blu-ray, you've already seen the first Sweeney. Which is also pretty good. Hopefully you've also seen this film before listening to the audio commentary, but we're in any case, let's go. Sweeney 2 was shot over the course of 5 weeks, starting on November 7th, 1977, and released in April 1978. According to Pat Gilbert, Troy Kennedy Martin handed in his script on October 26th, just 12 days before filming started. Okay, so this opening scene with the walkie-talkies seems like as good of an opportunity as any to mention where the flying squad gets its name from. This passage is taken from the TV series' Bible, which was written in 1974. The term flying squad derived from the fact that unit was originally equipped with a fleet of sports cars coordinated by wireless telegraphy. This was one of the first attempts in Britain to apply radio control techniques to police work. High mobility is still a feature of flying squad operations. The squad is still equipped with high-performance cars, normally within the 2.5 to 3 liter range. Now, if you're wondering about the difference between flying squad and CID in Scotland Yard, here's some background on the flying squad, popularly referred to as the Sweeney, taken from the show's Bible. Flying squad came into being during the 1920s when criminals began to use motor cars. Then, as now, the majority of all criminal detection within the Metropolitan Police District was handled by CID units at divisional level. The flying squad was formed to transcend divisional boundaries in the effective pursuit of mobile criminals. At present, the flying squad consists of 150 detectives headed by a senior officer of commander rank. The operation element of the squad consists of 4 units, each commandeered by a detective chief inspector. With each unit, there are 2 detective inspectors, each commanding 2 detective sergeants, and a varying number of detective constables. A small number of women detectives work within the squad. The squad's main task is to prevent major crime by establishing very thorough networks of intelligence within the criminal fraternity. The flying squad hope that if they cannot prevent a crime, their specialist knowledge will enable them to arrest the people who perpetrated it fairly quickly. The squad itself relates with other senior crime detection units, which have subsequently been formed within Scotland Yard, like Serious Crime Squad, Regional Crime Squad, Robber Squad, the Fraud Squad, which is my personal favorite, the Drug Squad, and lately the Bomb Squad. Here's some interesting background on what a typical production schedule for the TV version of the Sweeney was like. Taken from the show's Bible again. Each film, meaning each episode, is shot over 10 days. We must therefore shoot an average of 5 minutes edited screen time a day. This means we have to impose restrictions on the number of locations we use. Normally 10 locations, 1 per shooting day is enough. By location, we mean an area in which a number of scenes can be shot. For example, a school or college during holidays affords us a variety of interesting locations. Chapels, classrooms, laboratories, extensive grounds does not necessitate the uneconomic use of the film unit's time. The more time we spend loading and unloading vehicles and driving around London, the less time within 10 days we have to actually make a film. Right, so now the blaggers, as they will be commonly referred to in the film, or the robbers, make their move. This looks like the car park from the first Sweeney film, the one that's the site of another fatal ambush and a bit of chest puffing from Jack Regan, the series' star anti-hero. Their weapon of choice here in this film, though, is a gold-plated sawn-off Purdy shotgun, or it's supposed to be a Purdy shotgun. It's actually a Beretta, since Purdy wouldn't make one for the film. The gold plating, as you see, and the fact that it's sawn off shows you that these guys are pros. They've also got a sentimental streak, so they're like proto-Michael Mann thieves, romantic and flashy, but also no-nonsense professionals, get me? Anyway, so now, if you're a fan of the Sweeney, you might be wondering where the normal superintendent, Haskins, is, and why Denholm Elliott's character of Jupe has replaced him. Haskins was absent from the first film, also due to a scheduling conflict for actor Garfield Morgan. Also, Elliott is one of a handful of utility players that the series would have on, as in the great Season 3 episode where John Hurt plays a disgruntled computer programmer who hacks into his former company and steals money using his elite hacking skills. That's a really fun episode. Aired fairly recently before this movie did, since Sweeney 2 came out theatrically between seasons 3 and 4. Series creators write in the show's Bible that, quote, experience indicates that within the film format, it is better to provide a number of major parts which attract leading actors and actresses rather than a cycle of cameos which are difficult to cast. Few players of ability are interested in a one-page scene. Now, when they say the film format, they just mean the regular episode format. But so the same principles apply. You probably recognize Denholm Elliott from a number of performances, maybe Dennis Potter's Brimstone and Treacle, Trading Places, Raiders of the Lost Ark. He is pretty much money in the bank as he is here. So here, Elliott plays Jupe, a corrupt superintendent that John Thaw's character, Jack Regan, refuses to stick his neck out to save. It's a very chilly but practical move on Regan's part because, as he says, quote, any officer testifying in his defense is asking to be tarred with the same brush. Now, from the Sweeney Companion, they say the character of Jupe was modeled on disgraced Flying Squad commander Kenneth Drury. Troy Kennedy Martin, the screenwriter, says that I was really worried about how corrupt the CID were. I remember that Inspector Drury said power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he took me around his office, and there were pictures of all these guys in the flying squad, and none of the pictures were straight on his wall. So if you're wondering why that's a bit on the nose, it's because so is reality. According to director Tom Clegg, the villains were like the Magnificent Seven robbing a bank. They had a sense of injustice about how this country had gone down the drain. Troy Kennedy Martin adds that all villains are conservatives. You rarely need a left-wing villain, although one of the great train robbers was supposed to be a labor supporter. In the series, Regan's always bumming a phone call at a nearby pub, but he always has such contempt for pub owners, mostly because they turn a blind eye to criminals, another, nefarious clientele. Aiding and abetting in the show's code of honor is always almost as bad as doing crime yourself. So basically, if you're not working for the Sweeney, you're working against them. This movie is really front-loaded with a lot of the emotional payoff that, as the film goes on, grows heavier just by the sheer fact that it takes Jack Regan, the show's main anti-hero protagonist, so long to deal with his emotional baggage through a case that, in true Sweeney fashion, doesn't pay off or resolve the way one might hope. The pregnant, unresolved emotions of this scene with Regan and Jupe just sort of looking at each other, not saying anything, that sort of guilt hangs over the rest of the film, never fully dissipates, which is saying something considering the rest of the movie isn't even about Jupe. So Regan takes a moment, goes back to the grind, but before he can do that, as if to grab viewers' attention and make sure that we remember these prefatory scenes, we get one more flashback to Jupe's office where he warns Jack that absolute power corrupts absolutely, which Jack just shrugs off and then Jupe gives Jack one last word. I want you to nail this team. What's so special about them? They're blaggers. They rob banks. In other words, there's nothing special about them. It's just your job. Now, James Donald, writing in Made for Television, Euston Films Limited, a rather good book, adds this about the use of film and how it shaped the series' style. The novelty of using 16mm for a drama series and the suspicion with which it was regarded also led to a rather conservative mise-en-scène. As a result, as producer Ted Childs now admits, many of the shots on screen were, quote, a little too prissy and Christmas card-like, lacking the gritty, grainy realism they should have had and could have had. Donald continues, certainly the Sweeney's treatment lacks either the realist edge or the mythologized quality of the city in such near-contemporary Hollywood films as The French Connection, which Child claims as a stylistic influence, or Don Siegel's Dirty Harry, with its play on voyeuristic long shots and sometimes vertiginous helicopter shots. Whether this can be attributed wholly to the needs for cheapness is a matter of question. major crimes is often violent, and one does not wish to flinch from the reality of this. Nevertheless, the series is being produced for transmission in both afternoon and evening family viewing hours. Accordingly, we must respect the rules laid down by the IBA, meaning the Independent Broadcasting Authority, which oversaw the regulation of British commercial TV, in respect of language and the detailed description of pathological forms of behavior. Four-letter words are not permissible, nor can we indulge in souped-up horror, like represents in slow motion a security guard having his head blown off by a shotgun. Action within our brief does not mean continual violence. With the technique at our disposal, it is possible to show characters in a variety of interesting, real situations where movement and action serve to underline the pace and style of cinematic storytelling based on short dialogue scenes. This is the particular style we are trying to set. Now, as I mentioned a bit in the earlier audio commentary for the first Sweeney film, there were some differences of opinion about the style and politics of the series between producer Ted Childs and series creator Ian Kennedy Martin, as well as Ian's brother Troy Kennedy Martin, who scripted the film you're watching now. According to James Donald, Ted Childs saw their difference of stylistic opinions stemming from, quote, conflicting perceptions of realism within a popular genre. Childs saw this in terms of crime movies and to a lesser extent the verite documentaries he had worked on previously. Realism, in this view, was a device for adding an extra frisson to the fiction. Now quoting Childs, those of us who were concerned with the production and direction as opposed to the concept in the scripts were influenced by the French Connection. This was the genre piece current at the time we made the pilot and the first series. We were all taken by that sort of realism. The much-quoted shot was Gene Hackman with his paper cup standing across the street while two drug peddlers are having a slap-up meal in a Manhattan restaurant. Donald says that Ian Kennedy Martin's conception was diametrically opposed to this. For him, realism meant telling the unvarnished truth about the flying squad in the mid-70s. His original ideas had been to explore the impact of Robert Mark's appointment as commissioner of the Metropolitan Police on a detective in the flying squad whom Kennedy Martin knew. Now quoting Ian Kennedy Martin, quote, he was an uncorrupted cop. I knew this by experience. There were the great shadows starting to come over the flying squad, which would end up with the arrest of Commander Drury. This friend of mine in the flying squad, a man of great experience, was now being held by Commissioner Mark, that he had to work in a different way, that he was not to go into pubs in Fulham and talk to villains, that he must not make those contacts. It could all be done from a desk in an office on the 3rd floor of Scotland Yard. Ian Kennedy Martin disliked the influence of shows like Starsky and Hutch on the series, however, as Donald notes. I kept saying things like, the series has to be about real people and real situations. We don't have to invent anything. If the writers just go down to meet some of these people in Scotland Yard, they'll find out what's actually happening. So let's not have diamond robberies at London Airport and attractive females getting laid. It'll work the other way, just real people in real situations. But quickly, it became about unreal people in unreal situations, as Donald writes. Donald has this to say about the Sweeney TV series politics. Some of the complaints mouthed by Regan in 1975 had been expressed 2 years earlier in more sober terms in the BBC's Dimbleby Lecture by Robert Mark, the most vociferous cop of the decade. The Dimbleby Lecture, by the way, is an annual address hosted by the BBC and delivered by a noted business or political figure like Bill Clinton, Richard Dawkins, Bill Gates, etc. Back to Donald. On the disillusionment policemen felt with the workings of the law and their sense of unrewarded self-sacrifice, Mark had this to say. Some people cling to a curious, old-fashioned notion that there is something vaguely improper in a policeman talking about the law, the courts, or lawyers. No doubt the general shift to demand that the same way about the infantrymen. No doubt the general staff felt something vaguely improper in a policeman talking about the law. No doubt the general staff felt the same way about the infantrymen on the Somme, but as Lord Devlin has said, the police have a right to demand that the path they must tread should be carefully designed to lead to a just result for whom they act as well as for the accused. You simply cannot ask men to do one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs of our time and expect them not to reason why.
Gloria Barrington, age 19.
Donald points out that Troy Kennedy Martin, who scripted Sweeney 2, has expressed fears about the phenomenal popularity of Stratford Johns' bullying detective Barlow from Z-Cars, a cop drama that he created and that ran for almost 800 episodes from 1962 through 1979. 9. Troy Kennedy Martin says, quote, "The avidity with which the press greeted Barlow as the stern face of authority, the vengeful father, surprised me. I felt it was a stereotype which should have been automatically resisted in the production office. After all, it seemed an amazingly old-fashioned concept. But this love affair with authority, this identification with power, if there are psychological roots for British fascism, they are here." James Donald then quotes from Sweeney writer Trevor Preston, who had similar reservation about as Troy Kennedy Martin, only about, well, the Sweeney. Preston says, quote, "The major criticism which I find to have a certain element of truth in it is that the Sweeney reinforced the police's view of themselves. I tend to agree with that now, but I'm being a bit of a hypocrite because I'm only agreeing in retrospect. Had I had my time over again, I wouldn't have written some of the scripts I have written, to be quite truthful." You'll find some of the best character-driven stuff in this series is run here, though, in this interaction between Regan and the father of one of the car accident's victims. Her father asks, "Why did you have to do it? When you knew my daughter was in the car, why block the cars like that?" Sullen but firm, he says, "To stop them." I also like when Regan blurts out, "He was my driver." He's delirious, thinking of Big John's health only in terms of how it affects him. But he quickly recovers and goes to bat for George, the flying squad cop that Big John was paired with, as if to establish that he's in shock, but he's not really a narcissist. So Regan adds, "It wasn't George's fault." George being George Carter, Regan's sidekick, played by future Minder star Dennis Waterman. Right. So by the time they made Sweeney 2, writer Troy Kennedy Martin had already worked on the script for the original Michael Caine Italian Job. So he was believed to not only be the definitive writer of the series, by producer Ted Childs anyway, but also thought to have had a good foundation in movie making. "We weren't as inhibited as the second time around," notes Ted Childs in the Sweeney Companion. To pin down, then again, according to the Sweeney Companion, Troy Kennedy Martin went missing while he scripted Sweeney 2. Quote, "To pin down Troy was incredibly difficult," director Tom Clegg says, "so they eventually locked him in a room at the top of Colette Court, which was the series' main shooting location, and told him that he wasn't going out until he had finished it. He got out by ringing up the secretary and telling her that he desperately needed a drink and some jelly babies, so he went off to Scotland Yard for 5 days, or sorry, not to Scotland Yard, to Scotland, where no one could get in touch with him." Troy Kennedy Martin also says that, quote, "In the 60s, when I wrote The Italian Job, I was younger and more optimistic, as was everyone. People like Michael Caine were around, really confident characters. There was that line in it, 'We can always take it to the Americans.' That was really what I felt about movie scripts. There was that kind of feeling, and it was meant to be a comedy thriller. By Sweeney 2, I was a lot more cynical. I was divorced and had children." Sorry, that's probably not appropriate laughter, but it's funny. It's funny. It's...
All right, give it me slow. Where's Carter? Out at Radler. Somebody put...
Now, here's a key scene where the show's defensive mentality is pretty well established. Everything that Jupe has been tried and convicted of is SOP. And everybody at Flying Squad knows it, because that's just what it takes to get the job done in their eyes. Regan's bosses know. They know where the squad's information comes from. They just turn a blind eye because that's how it goes. So you get clip dialogue like, "If the girl dies, there will be an investigation. Carter will have some explaining to do." It's very straightforward, unsentimental stuff. This is the job, and you have to keep doing it.
I don't think so.
No matter what. All the time. Non-stop. Day and night. You get the idea. Now we get a confrontation with Mick and Shirley, the latter who is a Nazi sympathizer and a blacker accomplice. The scene features some more choice Troy Kennedy Martin dialogue, like when Regan points out that the death of Shirley's old man was suicide, not murder, since, quote, "anyone who did what he did was past caring." He adds, "Her husband's a driver. She screws his mates. In bed they talk," which, to my mind, is hard-boiled poetry. James Donald points out that Troy Kennedy Martin had expressed fears, quote, about the phenomenal popularity. Well, no, he says that certainly the anti-authoritarianism of the Sweeney was populist, in that it invoked an opposition between the interests of the people, us, and the actions of a self-serving bloc, them. It was also reactionary in that its villains were usually stereotyped deviants or outsiders, Nazi sympathizers. Sorry, but an account of the ideology of the Sweeney, which simply identifies in the program certain attitudes and values that also characterize the politics of resentment or backlash against permissiveness in the early 70s, would be begging the chicken and egg question. Donald points to a speech that Regan delivers in Abduction, the season 1 finale, which aired in 1975. Regan in that episode says, "I sometimes hate this bastard place. It's a bloody holiday camp for thieves and weirdos, all the rubbish. You age prematurely trying to sort some of them out. You try and protect the public, and all they do is call you fascist. You nail a villain, and some ponced-up, pinstriped amateur barrister screws you up like an old fag packet on a point of procedure, then pops off for a game of squash and a glass of Madeira. He's taking home 30 grand a year, and we can just about afford 10 days in Eastbourne and a second-hand car."
Haven't seen him for a very
No. Oh, referring to this rant, Donald writes that, quote, "Its semantic content, to use a grammatical analogy, was certainly drawn from a political discourse that had a currency beyond the limits of crime fiction. But that does not tell us how formally, syntactically, they were worked into the fictional form of the Sweeney, nor how these fictions might have helped to shape its viewers' ideas about authority and deviance." He adds, "Popular narratives like the Sweeney create, to use Frederick Jameson's phrase, a mapping fantasy for the viewer, a fantasy in the sense that they give shape to unconscious wishes and anxieties rather than the external actuality of crime and policing, a mapping fantasy in that the coordinates of their representations are drawn from a historically specific stock of imagery," which I think is a fascinating way to think of this, rather than reductively say, like, oh, which reflects what? You know, that's a really compelling point. Meanwhile, in Malta, here we get more proto-Michael Mann stuff. Some of the later scenes around the pool also make me think of Sexy Beast, which is shot in Agua Amarga in Spain. Though it looks kind of similar, doesn't it? I'm thinking in particular of a Sexy Beast's early poolside scene. Pat Gilbert notes that the main location for the Malta scenes is the island of Gozo, quote, where Ted Child had managed to rent a large villa that would serve as the villain's hideaway and double as accommodation for cast and crew. With customary guile, a deal was struck with Air Malta, allowing crew to film a scene on the island to the Mediterranean in which Regan tries to pull an air stewardess. Producer Ted Child said that, quote, "Malta looked as if the Second World War had finished there yesterday with great loss of life and terrible damage to property. It was a bit of a Kazi, really, but Gozo was completely unspoiled. The word was that the hotel we used for the villain's residence was mafia-owned." Gilbert adds that despite the holiday setting, the crew's 8-day stay was dominated by long hours and a hectic shooting schedule. Camera operator John Maskell says it was hard work. Once we were there, we didn't have to travel much. We just climbed over the wall of the hotel and we were on set. Some people had a wild time over there, but I didn't get too involved personally. There's nothing good about trying to operate a camera with a hangover. Now we get a car park rendezvous, this time with Regan and Carter's group is drunk. But again, the job goes on, so they soon get to what they came to see, which is the second getaway car the surviving robbers escaped in. Backing up a moment, both of the theatrically released Sweeney films were made with EMI Films, a spin-off of the record label, with the help of a British mogul named Nat Cohen. EMI also produced Get Carter, a noted influence on the Sweeney TV series. Speaking of it's noted in the official Sweeney companion book that Euston Films collaborated with EMI to ensure a British theatrical release through the ABC theater chain. David Wicks, who wrote and produced a number of the TV series' episodes, said that it was, quote, producer Lloyd Shirley who pushed for the film, and that, to quote the Sweeney companion, there was a perceived need to make the Sweeney movie appeal to the international market. Wicks says that they knew that they had to have major overseas sales, although they couldn't support a budget for it, and the budget wasn't great. It was a British TV series, and the way we in this country would love to think otherwise, when a Japanese bus driver gets up in the morning, he's not going to say, so must go and see British TV series. God, that's racist. He doesn't do that. You have to win him and work hard for him. You need to get the ingredients right. There had to be overseas sales. Otherwise, we'd never have another. And that would be the end of Euston Films, virtually. Nat Cohen of EMI understood this very well. Senior producer Ted Childs agrees and said that there's a view that the first film ought to be different. Those of us involved shared that view as well. There should be more stunts and a grander design. I remember going to see Nat Cohen with Lloyd and George at EMI. They had an interest in Thames at the time. And George said, what are you going to offer? Most people on Monday night will sit at home and watch your show. Why would they put their coats on a wet night and walk down to the ABC at Fulham Broadway and see what they can see for nothing when they can see what they can see on the telly? Now, we get introduced to Robert Soames, Regan's new driver. He is played by Michael J. Jackson. The concept of switching over drivers is an interesting one, so I figured we'd get into that a little. This is from the series Bible. The candidates for the flying squad are normally selected from CID personnel at a divisional level who have shown particular prowess. Of course, it is possible for a detective to be selected from a division to serve in the flying squad, to return to a divisional appointment upon promotion, and subsequently to rejoin the flying squad at a later date. And a little more from the show Bible. One interesting feature of the squad's operation is that its detectives do not normally drive themselves. Each car is driven by a driver. These drivers are not detectives, but expert traffic division constables. They are seconded to the flying squad to work in plainclothes. Drivers do not undertake detective work per se, although as police constables, they may well assist with arrests, etc. Here's a passage from the show's Bible about how the series' style of production lends itself to shooting action scenes rather than complicated dialogue scenes. This scene is based on the use of a film unit which moves very quickly across a number of locations. The number of our film operation itself very much determines the style of our films. In general, we can cope with action more readily than we can with multi-handed dialogue. Unlike television, where extensive rehearsal facilities and the use of several cameras for any given scene enable fairly complicated sequences involving several actors to be staged quite easily, we have to light every individual shot for one camera. Also, we cannot enjoy the luxury of extensive rehearsal. This makes complicated dialogue scenes difficult for us. Now, Regan gets to the real business at hand of informing Carter that the girl from the car accident is dead, and he needs to prepare himself to be the target for an investigation. Again, a very roundabout, sublimated sort of tension here, one where the personal stakes are nailed down, but only sometimes directly addressed. The main drama is catching the blaggers, but the stuff about Carter is often returned to and gives this movie a very satisfying and not entirely typical weight. I think it's what puts Sweeney 2 over the top. It's one of the show's best narratives and really one of its best outings, period. And now we're going back to Bob in the car. Don't call him Bob. Now we get the briefing with the nigh-on pornographic ad showing Shirley Hicks with some colorful commentary from the squad's members. It's worth noting, as Paul Moody does in his film, or in his book EMI Films and the Limits of British Cinema, that Sweeney 2 was subjected to greater censorship than the first Sweeney film was. Moody writes, the first film took its opportunity to be much more explicit on the cinema screen than would have been allowed on television, and was passed on uncut with an X certificate on its original release, although the BBFC registered its concern about, quote, excessive bloodshed in a few scenes. Moody adds that the film's success at the box office ensured that Sweeney 2 appeared at the box office the next year, and EMI, with a greater degree of control over the product as its principal funder, ensured that the film's content was toned down from the original, meaning the original theatrical film, not the original series. EMI sent a draft of the script to the BBFC for its approval before filming commenced, and was asked for changes to the naked girl with spread legs over the car mascot, and was informed that it would prefer not to see the girl urinate during the raid on the factory. There was some debate at the BBFC as to whether the completed film should be an AA certificate or an X, but it was felt that the final scene of violence was aversive realism, and even Regan was repulsed by it, that it could be acceptable for an AA. They decided to allow the company to make the decision themselves on commercial grounds, since the censorship issues were far from clear-cut, and EMI felt that an AA was more appropriate in this instance. Now, as Pat Gilbert writes, quote, as a cinematic experience, Sweeney 2 was far superior to its predecessor. Although I don't know if I go far superior, but it's superior. Yet it underperformed at the box office and didn't travel well overseas either. Ted Childs partly blames the fact that it was released when the Sweeney had been absent from TV for nearly a year and a half, and therefore launched into a void. Chris Burt, who edited the film, complains that it didn't have enough sex or violence, which is why it only got a 15 certificate. I'll interject at this point and say that the first Sweeney film did have an X certificate, which is the American equivalent of an R rating, but Sweeney 2 was given an AA for viewers 14+, which is about the same as a 15 in England. But it should be noted the BBFC rating did recertify Sweeney 2 with an 18 certificate when it was released on video in 1987. Every subsequent release of the film has been rated 18, so about the same as the first film. I think we should nick him. Doesn't even matter what he's referring to when George says he wants to steal something. What matters is Regan's non-committal reply. Yeah, I know, George. Which is a pretty wan pat on the shoulder, as you can see for yourself.
I want this to be very low-key but thorough. Treat her as if she were a target criminal. Yes, Captain. And as for you, darling...
God, I'd love to be wearing some of the clothes these guys could wear. Better yet, I'd love to be able to pull that off. You know, you can wear it, but you can't necessarily do it, you know? Is my opinion.
Yeah, I know, George.
Right, back to Malta. News breaks that they're going for one more job. Repairs and construction costs for their getaway dream home. Typical in the sense that we often spend time with the baddies and see what their kitchen sink lives were like. Mostly just to illustrate how they think they're doing fine but are actually living on borrowed time. But these guys are different because there's an almost funereal hush surrounding them. They don't want to make any noise because they're also living with the deaths of the guys that died on the last job. Here's Tom Clegg on Sweeney 2. Tom Clegg being the director of the film. Troy was going on about it being absolutely essential that we go to Malta to get the contrast. He went on and on. I was on his side, and executive producers George Taylor and Lloyd Shirley said, well, we'll have to work out the budget. Troy told them they were penny-pinching bastards, and they had no idea how to make a film. Anyway, we did go to Malta, and we filmed there, and I think it added an awful lot to the film. When it was shown at BAFTA, after Troy, Ted Childs, Lloyd Shirley, and myself were on the panel, Troy stood up and said, the scenes abroad were not really essential. We didn't really need to go out there. Unbelievable. Troy Kennedy Martin is also quoted as saying that everyone wanted to go to Malta. I used to take the kids there when they were small, and the crew had worked so hard, so the idea was to have a couple of weeks in the sun. But not everybody got to enjoy a couple of weeks in the sun. According to the Sweeney companion, Denholm Elliott, who plays Jupe, says that making Sweeney was, quote, painfully reminiscent, unquote, of the time he had been arrested in L.A. for making a left turn, quote, after a couple of dry sherries. In America, they don't differentiate much between someone who's made a wrong left turn at 3 a.m. and someone who's just strangled their grandmother. I don't know about you, but imagining Denholm Elliott saying that in his accent is just delightful. Then, right on to the next job, which climaxes with the car stunt that was a big thing for the film and was advertised heavily as one of the film's main attractions. Pat Gilbert writes a bit about a behind-the-scenes mishap that occurred during the filming of the stunt. Quote, stunt arranger Peter Braham had devised a chase that ended with the villain's motor smashing through a plate glass window at the gym. At the Grim Arndale Shopping Center in Wandsworth. Good job, Simon. In the following scene, the chief lag played by Ken Hutchison, drops his signature weapon, a gold-plated Purdy shotgun, as he switches getaway cars. When Clegg saw the rushes, he felt it wasn't clear what had happened to the weapon and used the day of pickup shots at the end of the 5-week shoot for a quick retake. As it was just one shot, the director didn't bother applying for another weapons permit. According to Ted Childs, this was irrelevant anyway during the shoot because the armor license to keep the gun disappeared to put a bet on a horse. At the point the weapon was dropped, a comedy of errors ensued, with the sawn-off abandoned on the ground. Peter Braham refused to pick it up, feeling with Wandsworth being his old stamping ground and the police having long memories, being caught holding an unlicensed shotgun might not be a good idea. Consequently, first assistant director Bill Wesley retrieved the weapon and was immediately accosted by a rookie constable who had been watching the shoot. Since Wesley was usually the instigator on the crew's practical jokes, Clegg decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. This young policeman said, "Have you got a license for that? It's a dangerous weapon." Bill said, "No, someone else has the license. I'm just holding it for him." So we all gathered around him and said, "Yes, you're right, officer. He's holding a dangerous weapon without a license. That's not on." So they carted him off in a police car. Great prank, guys. Gilbert goes on to write, "To make matters worse, everything that evening, there's the stunt. There was a rap party for the film at Colette Court. Ted Childs was informed the unit's first assistant director was being held at Wandsworth Police Station for possession of an illegal firearm. Childs set off to bail him out. His skill at sweet-talking cops by this time well honed. Quote, there was a party at Colette Court when the caterer stayed late to do the food, says Childs of a previous such occasion. He ended up getting a bit pissed and drove over a copper's foot on his way out. He didn't do any permanent damage, but the copper nicked him. So I remember being in the station at Hammersmith trying to reason with the sergeant while stuffing fibers into the jar on the counter for the police benevolent fund. They let him go in the end. Imagine the experience with stuffing fibers into the jar. It reminds me of the scene we just saw with the benevolent fund for Big John. I wonder if they're connected. I cannot swear to it, but they do seem similar, so it's worth pointing out. Yet another scene that reminds me that people on skateboards cannot be trusted. I'm sorry, it's just science. Regan shows up and talks to the bank job's inside man. I like that the normally rather strident morality of the show isn't so much toned down here, but just not played up as much. So it's sometimes only there if you're looking for it, like take this inside guy. Gets taken advantage of, which would normally make him the target of Regan's snobby remarks. But by the time Regan shows up, this guy has already paid the price, nursing a bloody and bandaged wound on his hand. So Regan asks one of his guys to get the inside man a cup of coffee instead of scolding him. He doesn't need to scold the guy, really. He's already paid the price for falling in with blaggers.
10 o'clock this morning, they walked through the door.
Yeah, get this man a cup of coffee.
Well, not to worry, son.
How's he going to hold it? That's my question. I mean, presumably they're not, the bandages are not as bad as they look, but,
What did they get?
I mean, they look bad. They look, oh, look at that face. They look bad.
What about serial numbers? We've got most of them. Well, that's something.
Now we see the robbers get away, which reminds me, director Tom Clegg quoted in Pat Girlbut's Shut It, which is a book that you want to be seen reading on the subway because of the title. I mean, it's a good book, but anyway, it adds that I loved the idea that all these villains were very conservative and wanted to invest their money abroad. They were capitalists, and Britain at that time was too socialist for them. The story was based on a real character who lived in Spain and kept going back to London to do jobs. He was eventually arrested, hiding in an attic in Watford. And we return to the scene of the car stunt, which gives me an excuse to quote Bill Wesley from, again, Pat Girlbut, Shut It. Wesley, speaking of the shotgun incident, adds, I got nicked. We had just finished shooting, and this cadet policeman happened to walk past. He had seen me pick the shotgun up, and he played it by the book and arrested me because I wasn't the one who had the license for it. Bang to rights. I wasn't allowed to pick the gun up, only the man that supplied the gun and the two actors. When we got down to the police station, it was more or less laughed out, but the policeman who was with the cadet couldn't belittle his colleague because legally he was in the right. Of course, that went around the studio and the film industry like wildfire. Bill Wesley's been nicked for carrying a shotgun. So, I imagine that's a incident that sticks.
Yeah, more than likely.
Yeah, this scene's going to end with a clipped word from Regan to Carter that I find to be sneakily revealing. Yeah, look into that, George. You know, more of the cold shoulder from Regan to Carter. Regan just can't bear to share more emotion with Carter. But that frigidity is not overplayed to my mind. Just a sign of their precarious friendship/work relationship balance at this moment in time.
Should be enough air there for a week. When they finally get...
You'll have to forgive me, I had some espresso to get me wound up for this commentary.
You know where 14 Delta 34 is? Hexagon Hotel.
Alright, it was a double espresso. Meanwhile, a bomb is about to go off in a luxury hotel and nobody wants to take responsibility. A small confluence of competing bureaucracies and jurisdictions as well as egos ensues. The underlying theme of this scene is, I'm not taking responsibility. Also, the drinks are on the management, right? Pat Gilbert writes that the scene's, quote, only purpose, it seems, is to show how all the various departments as representatives gather in the hotel bar to get pissed, work together chaotically. That's kind of a big point, I think. You know, still, Gilbert quotes Tom Clegg, who says, quote, there was a lot of contention about whether it should have gone in or not. Now that the plot is taking a bit of a downshift, it's worth noting Dennis Waterman, who plays George Carter, much preferred Sweeney Todd to the first theatrically released film, which is, to my mind, still a pretty good film. It's just not very Sweeney-like. In some ways, anyway. Speaking about the first film, he says, the script was thrown at us and we never really were involved in it until we started shooting. And that, quote, it was all beyond our remit. It was all oil barons and sheiks, and we suddenly had to have pictures of Big Ben and Tower Bridge. It was like when they film a comedy and move it into a totally different place. The second film was an absolute Sweeney job through and through. We were chasing blaggers, and they were very, very, very tough blaggers. We had a fantastic cast, and I thought that movie was infinitely better than the first one. I thought it was terrific. Again, worth noting, if only for the way that the people making the film seem to generally prefer this movie, which, let's face it, it's a good movie. I mean, if you disagree, I don't want to hear it.
Now listen, Doyle, we're all
And I won't.
discuss this over a large Jack Daniels. I presume the bar is open. It's all right, Jack. The drinks are on the management, right?
Now we are gonna meet Georgina Hale's unnamed switchboard operator, who I will refer to as Switchboard Susan for cheeky reasons. She's the first woman that Regan tries to pick up in the film, and ultimately, after some carry-on style hijinks, she's the one he goes home with. This comedic aside, and the way it weaves its way in and out of what is already a plot tangent, is striking. It just shows to Goya how things sometimes work out, some things recur, some things break down before they begin, others pick up later, only to break out and break down again, as they do with the switchboard operator, and sometimes they pay off also with her. Things blend together on the job. I think in that way the show is very much portraying a blue-collar sort of heroism that makes the show remain more than just its more propagandistic elements. It's not just pro or anti-cop, especially not in a superior entry like Sweeney 2. It's very much about the egos and shuffling about responsibilities that come with serving the public. I think that concept of the civil servant who wields power to help protect people is what makes the Sweeney such an entertaining and thoughtful bit of pulp fiction. I've seen some critics describe it as being dated, but, you know, it's inevitable, I guess. Here's a relevant passage from the Sweeney Companion. Regan appears tired and miserable throughout the film, throwing himself at every woman in sight, although these scenes are all amusing and complement great comedy sequence like the squad returning pissed from a brewery. The humor is undercut by the cynical and melancholy undertone. Regan's sickened reaction to Hill's suicide and his recent comments, "Let's get there before it's all over," give the film an air of weary finality despite the upbeat final scene. Spoiler alert for the final scene, which, again, if you're listening to this, I hope you've seen the movie already. Another characteristic line from the script is when Regan says, "You don't know Doyle and I do," which again speaks to the game of hot potato these characters are playing when it comes to deciding who is in charge.
Has it occurred to anybody that he hasn't asked for a drink?
Then right. So Regan's going to chat up Switchboard Susan. He makes an awkward but deliberate pass at her. Brow furrowed. It's a perfect synecdoche for the film because Carter's going to walk in on Regan before he can even get rejected or accepted by Georgina Hale's character.
Nice bottle of wine. Very nice meal.
This is neither here nor there, but I have Switchboard Susan on my mind just because one of the best concerts I saw this year was Nick Lowe. And if you have a chance to see Nick Lowe, he still got it. Thanks in no small part to Low Straitjackets. Just a fittingly tangential recommendation. Hale's rather good here, don't you think? She's always rather good. She's just one of these really good comedic actors. You might recognize her from her many collaborations with Ken Russell. She's Money in the Bank.
Yes, he does.
Now listen, Governor, either he's armed and dangerous or he's not armed and dangerous, right?
Oh, he just wants to be reconnected to the Paris number.
Good. Come on, it's all right. How many more times I've got to tell you? It's a basic play.
And no heroics, George.
Now, this big side tangent also reminds me of these concluding remarks from the show's Bible. The detectives of the Flying Squad are in the business of preventing major crime, as they keep reminding us. For much of their information about developments in the business of preventing major crimes, and for much of their information about developments in the underworld, they depend on informants and being around locales where suitable intelligence can be culled. From time to time, they are formed into larger units to deal with with particular crimes, but normally their brief is to be out around town, finding out what is going on. Their major concern is major crime, usually forms of robbery, including anything from holdups to hijinks. To an increasing extent, they are becoming involved with organized crime, where the proceeds of one crime are used to finance other crimes in addition to apparently legitimate enterprises. So the break for this case could come up anywhere, really, even in a completely unrelated case. It's something these guys have to look out for, or they can't really look out for it, but they have to remain open-minded and flexible because, you know, the people they're looking for are too. It's an organic process, as they say.
Who was the arresting officer? If I recollect, it was Endersby.
Endersby?
Now we join Carter and the French bomb guy. An interaction leads to another small but revealing change where the Frenchman notes, "You don't scare easy." And Carter, I know he's not French, but the accent's French. And then Carter, realizing that he's being complimented for behavior that's coming second nature to him, responds with, "Too stupid, I suppose." Here's another characteristic exchange from that. Who's the officer in charge? "You are, sir." Then he looks at his drink as if somebody put ashes into it.
Anyone care who he is?
On the house, sir.
You don't look like a waiter.
I'm not.
Hold this, will you? Très, très lentement.
Sorry?
Very, very slowly, please. don't scare easy.
No,
The guy I just referred to stupidly as the Frenchman is Yvon Doval, who plays a character named Mr. Mamoun.
The man in 594?
yes.
French gentleman. Lives in Beirut. Drinks.
We're getting some information about Mr. Mamoun from the sharply dressed barman. Again, a look I wish I could pull off, but I would look like an, well, not good.
Clean living, highly recommended.
He's a great
I hate drinking. Anyway, so, Mr. Mamoun remains genuinely mysterious despite some background information. I like that we never really know what his deal is for a bit, and that it's not really important beyond the fact that the cops see him as a threat, have to address it, are pretty much all called in to deal with it, and then made to sort it out, which lends a darkly funny sort of credence to Mr. Mamoun's line about why he didn't just talk to the cops first. The authorities tend to overreact, he says. Again, played by Yvon Doval, this character is primarily just defined by his behavior. He's not from around here, so he just assumes he can go to work and will be hailed as a hero. And we as viewers know that should be enough because we have contextualizing footage of him working with Carter. But that's not enough, as we'll soon see. Just another victim of too much red tape.
Why didn't you dial 999? I usually find that in these circumstances, the authorities tend to overreact.
Now for some post-bomb scare drinking. What's great about this scene is that Carter is basically a frayed nerve, while Mamoun who's going to arrive soon after him, is going to be acting as if he's the hero of the day, because he is. But Carter is completely just, three kinds of frazzled. So everybody else is drinking without him and them, and realizes that nothing of what they just did was worth that much aggravation. So they just pull up to the bar for a drink, where Carter is greeted with a warm sort of indifference. I like that when Mamoun is apprehended, he blurts out, "You're making a grave mistake," in French. And he says it in French. The whole extended sequence with Doval is, I think, pretty interesting in the sense that it shows you how far afield Troy Kennedy Martin and Tom Clegg and the show's writers were willing to go in terms of pushing the show away from familiar territory during the films. If you don't enjoy this sort of decadent hangout scene, you might find it plotting or monotonous or just, padding. But I think it's fun bit of experimentation, narrative, and pays off rather nicely. They have more money to make the film, as they did with the first theatrically released Sweeney film, and they use it to do something that's not quite conventional. I find that refreshing. Now here's a passage from the show's Bible about the show's style being dictated by budget. The mobility of our equipment and the sophistication of our editing and dubbing techniques allow us to produce action sequences which can attain a considerable degree of pace and excitement. This is not to say that we do not do good dialogue in our scripts. Clearly, an investigatory police thriller does depend to no small extent on good dialogue, but in general terms, it is better to write uncomplicated storylines which deal with straightforwardly with crime and criminals, where dialogue scenes are short and sharp rather than intriguing. However, when talking of action, it must be made clear that we are not in the Bondiana League, meaning not like James Bond films. We can cope with a limited number of fight scenes, car chases, shootouts, etc. We cannot blow up a Jablit representations of St. Paul's, nor bring the whole of Oxford Street to a grinding halt in order to wreck 3 police cars inside Selfridge's front window. Now, here's a chance for some background on Regan, since it dovetails with the way that Bob Soames is sort of treated like an interloper, while everybody else in the squad is shown to be part of a whole. This is taken from the series Bible. Main character in the Sweeney is Detective Inspector Jack Regan, age 36, a tough, resourceful detective who is played by John Thaw. Regan has been a policeman since he came to London from Manchester when he was 22. He served the statutory 2 years as a probationary police constable, then applied to join the CID. He served as a temporary detective constable and following this was made up to substantive detective constable and served within a division as a CID officer until promoted sergeant and transferred to the flying squad. Following this promotion to detective inspector, he worked with the divisional unit once and before returning to the flying squad, where he was been for the past 4 years. Now Carter busts a couple of bent cops who try to skim some dough from the money left behind in the last job's getaway car, which gives me an opportunity to say, or which gives him an opportunity to say the show's catchphrase of "You are nicked." I say it all the time. Here's the show's Bible on Carter. Detective Sergeant George Carter, age 26, so just a 10-year difference, is a tough, sharp Cockney who hails from Notting Hill, working-class lad on the make. Were it not for the fact that a concerned school teacher had instilled in him notions of public service, he might have ended up, quote, on the other side. Several of his school friends have. A keen sportsman, a former amateur boxing champion, he maximized use of his extensive sporting facilities, which are available to young policemen. By chance, he found he had naturalistic detective skill and was eventually offered an appointment within Flying Squad. He admires Regan very much and enjoys working with him, although they often argue over detailed methods of approach and styles of working.
You are nicked. Both of you.
Now, Switchboard Susan, the Georgina Hill character, is going to show up to Regan's place, but is going to find him passed out. A bit more of carry-on style humor, which, as you probably noted, was more of a feature of the films and the TV series, given the relatively loose censorship that Euston Films encounter when making these films, and I do emphasize relatively. Still, it's interesting to note that there's more winky-winky, insinuating sex humor, as if to compensate for the relatively downplayed nudity in this film. Remember, EMI had creative control, so they were a bit more on top of things before production began, and including finding out what did and didn't fly with the BBFC. So I can't help but wonder if they basically threw in some of the boys' club humor and raunchiness for the sake of upping the ante in some regards. Was that basically like a compensatory move? It seems that way, but I am not sure. This scene is very cheeky and fun. It is a laid-back quality that I really like because it's more about her impressions of Regan and his foisted attempts at romance than it is about whether or not they'll boff. There's a whole won't they quality to the scene, in other words, but it's not nearly as important as the humorous anti-climax of her stuffing Regan's apartment key into his pants through the fly. But before that, she finds the half-massacred spread of a meal that's been prepared in the hopes that the shade show up. Now, warm bottle of white wine, some cheese. Georgina Hale, I think, is never better than she is here. You might recognize her again from Ken Russell films like The Devils, The Boyfriend, Mahler. She plays Mahler's wife in Mahler, which is, I think, her best performance for Russell. Here in Sweeney 2, she does a lot with a toothpick-thin walk-on bit, which not easy to do, but she does it. Still, the weirdly sedate, exploratory pace of the scene reminds me of something you'd see in a made-for-TV movie from the 70s, something that's sort of halfway between a regular serialized episode of TV and a theatrically released film. What appeals to me about this, in an attempt to fill time, we just get to hang out with these characters, and in a way that diffuses the plot tension of things in a regular episode. We're exploring with them. And that, to me, is very appealing. This is what they're like. This is what it's like to spend time with them and what's really not going on when they're not chasing down Maltese blaggers. It's refreshing in a very fun, low-key sort of way, meandering. Here's some more information about Regan from the show's Bible. Quote, Regan is the total professional, a 24 hours a day cop. His commitment to his career led to the breakup of his marriage. He is divorced, visits his 8-year-old daughter fairly regularly. His ex-wife is now preparing to remarry. Regan finds it difficult to develop lasting emotional relationships with people. With women, he is prone to casualness, although not promiscuity. for obvious reasons.
Yeah?
He's proud of the flying squad and its reputation. Like most squad officers, he enjoys the considerable freedom the job pattern or the work pattern affords. This is one reason why he has not actively pursued promotion, since this would probably result in his transfer. Regan is contemptuous of the formality and bureaucracy which characterizes much of the police service. His casual style of dressing is one of his methods of articulating this resentment. I think in college, John Thaw, if I remember correctly, was had a bit of a mod, bit of Flash style. So that bit rings true anyway.
Thanks, George. That's a real breakthrough.
Now we're going to the final scene with Jupe, Denholm Elliott's character. The discussion that follows really firmly drives home the series' biggest ideas, namely that justice and fairness don't get to be enforced in this world without bending the rules a bit. You can hear that concept clearly and unpretentiously articulated by Jupe when he pushes back against Regan by saying, "Don't try to rubbish me, son. You've pulled a few strokes in your time." For more on the show, as a reflection of then contemporary anxieties, I refer you to James Donald from Made for Television. He writes, speaking about the show's season 1 finale, Abduction, what drives Regan, it seems, is not a desire for justice so much as the fantasy of a world that is clean and simple, an infantile, pre-cultural world devoid of anxiety and threat. Indeed, although it may seem paradoxical, crime and the law do not really figure very largely in the Sweeney. As I have already mentioned, little interest is shown in the character or motivation of criminals or the detailed logistics of crime and detection, the processes and the principles of lawmaking, complex issues about legal rights and responsibilities or civil liberties, procedures of courts and prisons. None of these figure into the series. Donald continues by comparing the Sweeney with the fairy tale simplicities of good and evil that Pauline Kael identified in her writing on Dirty Harry. What was particularly interesting about these rogue cop heroes was the way they were no knights in shining armor, but the secret sharers of the corruption they battled against. Regan might revile criminals as animals, but Kate, his ex-wife, knows Regan can behave like a stuck pig himself, and there is a measure of truth in an accusation from Knowles, a superior officer, that Regan is, quote, sick. This was the ambiguity that series creator Ian Kennedy Martin had originally wanted to explore. What the Sweeney shows is there are two kinds of villains on the scene. There are the police and there are the villains, and often they're interchangeable. Now, why should there have been such a notable feature of police fiction in the 70s, Donald asks. Certainly, this ambiguity is connected to other representations of the police then in circulation, but like then, it also tapped a widespread sense of anxiety and insecurity, which was, for many people, the way the political crisis was actually experienced. It was to such feelings, born of the clash between popular aspirations and economic recession, that the politics of Thatcherism was finally attuned. Thatcherism too relied on certain mythological images to focus resentment on the idea of an unholy alliance between the state and a number of scapegoats, muggers, scroungers, immigrants, terrorists, and so forth. These stereotypes are part of the same cartography as the characterizations and contemporary references in the Sweeney. They provide the coordinates on which its narrative are mapped. Which, again, I find that concept of mapping coordinates to be really well applied here. So, all credit to James Donald for applying that Frederick Jameson concept so well here. That essay in Made for Television is worth the is one of several reasons to pick up that book. It's a very good book. Very well-rounded, great sort of view, all-around view of how Euston worked and their cultural impact, the variety of their programming, their limitations. You know, just a very sharp book if you're interested in British television. Now, the flight to Malta with some more carry-on style humor, which would be monotonous and unnecessary if it didn't come after the scene with Jupe. Now we get the pleasure of seeing how desperately horned up Regan is without the annoyance of feeling like we're pointlessly already gotten the point already. The repetition of the two scenes is the point, but now it's at least more enjoyable thanks to the break. Also, Regan's habit of striking out with women kind of needs that intermediary prison scene to establish that, again, every breakthrough and change and bit of progress that occurs in their routine comes from small variations in routine, flexibility, and the fact that these guys are, in the show's creators' eyes, always on the clock.
This is not a holiday, love. We are in pursuit of certain hardened criminals who have taken up residence on the island of Malta.
Now, another quick dip back into the show's Bible for this great passage about Regan. Regan has been a successful detective. He has made his name by being very much his own man. Intuitive, with a keen understanding of human nature, he can appear an emotive, mercurial man. He will sometimes pursue criminals with a degree of ruthlessness which can shock people, used to seeing him as a cynically humorous but compassionate human being. Regan then is a good detective, but a man approaching middle age whose fears for his own emotional stability and long-term job security, that's it, sometimes float to the surface, as we see here. Poor Regan.
What's yours like?
I mean,
She is like...
you yapping at me.
Right. And she's a Chelsea supporter. Tell her you're a copper. No?
Now, back to Malta. And we see Regan and Carter try and are met with the duty officer and local authorities. And they negotiate to agree on the conditions for an interview, and the interview must be overseen by local authorities. Naturally, Carter and Regan ignore that recommendation, but that's par for the course in this with these guys. It's worth repeating that the Sweeney, meaning the show, not the second film, was doing rather well, both in terms of audience reaction and in terms of creative output. Season 4 is widely held to be sort of loosey-goosey, but strong ending, just unusual. I think season 2 is also a strong contender for the best, but there's some talks about doing a 5th season, but it never quite came off. For some speculation as to why, here's Pat Gilbert in Shot It, quote, when Series 4 hit the screens in September 1978, it proved even more popular than ever, which made the decision to kill off the program even more difficult. Most actors enjoy being regulars in a series. At the very least, it means guaranteed work. And John and Dennis Waterman were no exceptions. In the Electric Theater show interview in 1978, April, the pair argued that neither felt eclipsed or confined by being identified by the two main characters, the usual spur for actors wanting to leave a long-running show. If people see us in the street, they call us John and Dennis, not Regan and Carter, Waterman explained. So why did the principal actors pack it in? Towing the official line, producer Ted Child says that he'd, quote, talked to John Thaw afterwards, and we both decided we'd stayed a bit too long. But the series' creator, Eden Kennedy Martin, tells another story, which has long been known in the Sweeney's inner circle, but never publicly aired. All this stuff about I talked to Dennis and we agreed it was the end of it. Bollocks, says Kennedy Martin. The truth was John hadn't made enough money. He was a hard grafter. That 10-day turnaround up at 7 a.m. with a stinking hangover. Every director wanting that extra half hour always pushing it and trying to make a better show than the last director. He was worn out. They had a month's break between series 1 and 2, that was it. Then he had to learn all his lines, which took away his family life. Seems appropriately real enough. Now we're on to the Pharos compound in Malta, which is worth noting that Pharos is Greek for lighthouse. And now we go back to Gilbert, who says that it's, quote, not exactly clear exactly when it was decided to call time on the Sweeney, but it's evident from the playful joie de vivre of many episodes of season 4 that a kind of decadent end-of-term atmosphere prevailed. It was as if the writers were trying to write as much from the Sweeney, or wring as much from the Sweeney as possible while they still could. Jack and George get funnier, the sexuality and sexism get racier, protagonists' inner lives become darker and seedier, and the stunts get livelier. Personally, I don't think it's a big leap in logic to suggest that Sweeney 2 is part of that end-of-term atmosphere. The show's post-1978 life is, however, interesting and unusual, as Gilbert notes. Quote, as the 70s faded into history and a culturally more sensitive era dawned, comedy programs like The Black and Blue Lamp and Detectives on the Edge of a Nervous Breakdown went to town on the Sweeney's hard-boiled style, while impressionist Phil Cornwell did a great impression of Regan in the 2000s comedy Stella Street. In 1997, a Nissan Almera TV advert spoofed the Sweeney, paving the way for all manner of witty takeoffs, capped recently with an insurance ad declaring, "Get your glasses on, you're nicked." And in the last few years, Regan has famously become the model for DCI Gene Hunt in BBC's groundbreaking drama Life on Mars and its follow-up, Ashes to Ashes. As a no-bullshit northern plainclothes cop working in Manchester in the 70s and 80s against a backdrop of corruption, intrigue, and mind-bending existential time-traveling weirdness, Hunt was a triumph, not least because of his exquisite satirizing celebration of Ian Kennedy Martin's bullish creation. You need only dip randomly into the Life on Mars spin-off book, DCI Hunt's Rules of Modern Policing, to get an idea of that. 1973 edition, in the chapter Making an Arrest, officers are advised to ignore the bullshit. On your way to the station, you will hear enough stories to give Enid Blyton a run for her money. He needs the lab, he needs fresh air, he needs medication. What he needs is a gentle slap to the gob and to learn to appreciate the pleasure of silence. Recommendations like that are one of the many reasons why I really recommend all of the books that I'm citing. Pat Gilbert's Shut It being a prime example. Just really well researched. He put in a lot of time doing the interviews. It's well worth digging into. Now, there were some spin-off novelizations, including one for Sweeney 2, and a couple of them were scripted by Troy Kennedy Martin, the screenwriter of Sweeney 2. In more recent years, there'll be a reboot film in 2012 starring Ray Winstone as Jack Regan, British rapper Plan B as George Carter, and Damian Lewis as Frank Haskins. They're joined in the film by Haley Atwell, who plays a fellow Flying Squad character named Nancy Lewis. And before that, there was a couple of revival attempts. Pat Gilbert notes that, quote, the first was in 1983 when, with Ian Kennedy Martin's blessing, Roger Marshall proposed a series which saw Regan transferred to Hong Kong in its last days under British rule, which I would kind of love to see that. I wish that happened. John wanted to do it, says Marshall, but it came to nothing. Ian Kennedy Martin himself attempted to resuscitate the show in 1998, writing a pilot script in which Carter, again to be played by Dennis Waterman, who Ian thought still looked great, returned as a commander, having been suspended from duty in the 80s. But somebody higher up at Thames, the parent company whose logo you see at the beginning of every Sweeney episode, put an end to that sort of talk, saying that remakes of older series weren't such a great idea. These are both tantalizing scenarios, especially given the original leading men's involvement, but Waterman's lead performance in Minder is equally terrific, as is John Thaw's turn as Inspector Morse. I'm personally rather partial to Thaw's performance as Peter Mayle in the miniseries version of A Year in Provence, which the miniseries is, generally speaking, leagues better than the Ridley Scott adaptation of Mayle's memoir. So seek that out if you want another really good John Thaw performance. Or if you've already seen it, see it again. I used to watch that all the time as a kid. Riviere. Anyway, that's a really, really fun, memorable Thaw performance. Annie. Oh, sorry. But in the 70s and 80s, the cultural impact of the Sweeney at the time also led to the creation of other series with varying degrees of success. Euston Films also rolled out The Professionals from 1977 to 83, which was a more violent cop drama. But while it lasted longer than the Sweeney, it wasn't quite as groundbreaking or as compelling. There was also Target from 1977 to 78 that felt like an equally fine but inessential cop drama. There was, however, Law and Order, a 4-episode miniseries from 1978 that came out as a direct result and reaction to the Sweeney. For more on that show, here's Pat Gilbert. G.F. Newman, a friend of Troy Kennedy Martin, had also become concerned about the degree of corruption within the police in the 1970s, and also about the way television was avoiding the issue. In the mid-70s, he wrote a trilogy of novels, You Flash Bastard, Sir, You Bastard, and You Nice Bastard, concerning the rise to power of Terry Sneed, a totally immoral policeman at Scotland Yard. These were hard, uncompromising books, taking an extremely dim view of the police. Despite his friendship with the Kennedy Martin brothers, Newman was not happy with the arrival of the Sweeney, feeling that it would cover similar, unacknowledged ground to his Sneed books. Gilbert adds that, quote, Newman wrote Law and Order as a reaction against what he perceived as the Sweeney's naivete regarding real-world police corruption. But as Troy Kennedy Martin points out, Newman couldn't escape comparisons to the Sweeney. It was kind of inevitable, really, to my mind.
You don't say much, do you?
I don't like policemen.
Here's some more from Gilbert. Screened in 1978, Law and Order, the series, consisted of 4 connected plays about the criminal justice system made by the BBC and produced by Tony Garnett. Gilbert adds that the show was filmed in a matter-of-fact documentary style. The series was the total antithesis of the usual heroic portrayal of the police, especially given its focus on various different characters involved in Law and Order, like blackguard Jack Lynn and corrupt detective Fred Pyle. Law and Order was apparently so controversial that the BBC said they weren't going to air it a second time, though as Gilbert notes, the BBC did change their minds in time.
What's a virgin?
So that's another worth seeking out
Hang on a minute.
if you haven't seen it already,
Could you get any prints off of a...
or if this gives you a taste for something worth rewatching.
Yeah, sure. What is it?
Silver cup.
What's anything to do with the Purdy, Black?
Yeah, it is.
We got some off the shelves, you know.
Terrific. Can you see if you can match them up?
Now we're back to the Malta gang, who are not quite ready to sell, not quite ready to pack it in. They'll soon explain to their wives at dinner that they may still have to go back to London for one last job. These domestic scenes are quite the gear shift,
Grove Park.
and are a welcome attempt at going further with the domestic scenes than we often see of criminals with their malls and accomplices in the regular Sweeney series. By the way, if you're wondering about the connections with real-life Law and Order, there's some more interesting observations from Pat Gilbert, who notes that, quote, Regan and Carter's methods and un-PC 70s blokish swagger were ripe for lampooning, especially after police procedures were radically overhauled in 1984 with the passage of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. The legislation introduced stringent laws about taping interviews under caution and keeping written records of events such as house searches. It also took a dim view of the get your trousers on your Nick style of making an arrest, since now you had to tell a suspect who you were and read their rights, or else you undermine the prospect of getting a safe conviction. It's worth noting that the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984, or PACE, was precipitated by racial profiling uncovered by the Scarman Report on the 1981 Brixton riots. The Scarman Report found that racial profiling was used in a lot of stop and searches during and prior to the Brixton riots. The PACE law resulted in large part from the Scarman Report. PACE was mainly concerned with how evidence was gathered via warrants, tape records, also interrogation and detention, but also who was profiled. So it's always worth keeping in mind and just bearing in mind that there's not a lot of race in the or consideration of race in this show. It's a bit whitewashed, if I may.
We've done 17 flags. We've gained 1 point.
Back to Gilbert, who adds that from 1978 to 1984, Scotland Yard also underwent a wide-ranging external investigation of the practices courtesy of Operation Countryman, led by a force of provincial officers nicknamed the Swede, since they were regarded by many in the Met as country bumpkins unable to grasp the complexities of policing the capital. Countryman led to the retirement of around 400 officers. That's the number quoted at the time. I think a more recent number says something like 250, but, still, quite a bit.
Ready?
Gilbert also argues the cultural impact of the Sweeney can be seen in the way British viewers were not only being made more aware of corruption, but of regional slang. He writes that the Sweeney transformed the way the public perceived the nation's force of law and order. After all, before Regan, meaning the 1974 teleplay called Regan, the one that precedes the show, how many ordinary folk knew about the shadowy world of the flying squad and its network of informants and secret, possibly illegal deals, or considered that plainclothes policemen in fawn raincoats may have been hard-living but deeply human and complex blokes like Regan and Carter. Less predictably, perhaps, the Sweeney also enriched and influenced the English language for the first time, bringing the real argot of 70s Cockney villains and thief-takers into viewers' home front rooms. Causers, lags, blags, blimpers, meaning peeping toms, it's my favorite, blimpers, snouts, narcs, wheelmen, wiremen, stoppo drivers, tickles, snatches, placers, ringers, the filth, fit-ups, shooters, the list goes on. Notably, it introduced the word slag as a pejorative term for a man, as in Regan's "Come on, you slag," when he tries to revive a drunk in the episode Trojan Bus. Speaking of Trojan Bus and noteworthy episodes, there are a handful of noteworthy episodes in Season 3 that I wanted to recommend to viewers of the film. Ones that I think speak to the show's staying power and may be of interest to anybody who watches the film and hopes to see a lot more where it came from. As I mentioned, there's the terrific Season 3 episode with John Hurt as a revengement computer programmer, which is called Tomorrow Man. That episode originally aired on September 27th, 1976. There's also Bad Apple from the same season, which first aired soon after that on October 11th, 1976. That one's more directly about police corruption, since Regan and Carter are assigned to observe and report on a group of ex-urban small-town cops. In Season 3, there's also Lady Luck, which is a pretty good story about the abusive push and pull, fear and loyalty that leads some female supporting characters to stick by their criminal spouses. That one stars Moira Redmond and Norman Rodway and aired on December 13th, 1976. And there's also the terrific Season 3 finale, On the Run, which follows the search for a fugitive prisoner played by George Sweeney, reprising a role from an earlier episode called Taste of Fear. On the Run originally aired on December 20th, 1976. And the Blaggers getting ready the job and pivotal moment with a change of heart. Here's another great scene that I think is slowed down and character driven in a way that they aspired to in the series proper, and sometimes achieved. But I think they can afford to slow it down and give the appropriate gravity a moment like this deserves only in a film. There are also a number of noteworthy episodes from Season 4, the show's final pre-reboot season, which aired from September 7th of 1978 to December 27th of the same year. Sweeney 2 came out theatrically in April of that year, so roughly 5 months before Season 4's episodes started to air. There was, however, and again, as Gilbert noted, an end-of-season sort of change of tone that I think new viewers will find welcome, but I'm honestly not so sure about for older fans. For them, the Sweeney may be defined mostly by its first 3 seasons. Season 4 is not markedly different, but it's different enough. Even the writers of the authorized Sweeney companion thinks that the show, quote, had lost some of its early hard edge by Season 4. In their book, they note, quote, a new tone of pessimism. For every comedy set piece, there was a miserable downside. There had been over a year's break between the broadcast of the 3rd season and the final one, and John Thaw looked visibly grayer and world-wearier. Throughout the final season, Regan's character often seemed to be tired and fed up, prefiguring developments in the final story, Jack or Knave. Overall, there were various changes of style in the season, with all involved keen to keep the series as fresh as possible. The book's writers note that there's some changes to the show's opening credit sequence also, especially regarding the inclusion of a film-through car chase that makes the series look more like, well, Starsky and Hutch, which I bet did not please Ian Kennedy Martin. These titles, as Gilbert notes, these titles ended with an uncalled-for shot of Regan administering a blow to camera, punching the villain's face, a hint perhaps that the program had lost some of its subtlety. The closing titles, meanwhile, maintained an air of poignancy and world-weary exhaustion, depicting Regan and Carter wandering around the seedier parts of the West End, Regan finally stubbing a cigarette out on the pavement as the sequence and title music finished. The companion's writers also conclude, however, that unlike many other series... Sorry, I was quoting the companion, not Gilbert. But unlike many other series that outlasted their welcome, the Sweeney ended its 4-year run without losing out to its rivals or compromising on its ability to provoke the viewer. Arguably, a feature film every few years might have sustained the concept. However, as a television series, the Sweeney certainly quit while it was ahead, having reinvented British crime drama and finally established itself in the national consciousness. I should note that the Sweeney companion is also sort of invaluable. Really great, thorough view of the show, and really good if you already like the show and are like hip deep in it and just want to like flick to a specific episode or detail or just refresh yourself. It's a good little book to have on your nightstand. If you have one anymore. Now, the actual heist is going down. I'll make some Season 4 recommendations in a moment, but I did want to give viewers some more background on the show's 4th season before proceeding. This is also from the official Sweeney Companion. Quote, the production team had reservations about going ahead with the 4th series of the season. As series writer Trevor Preston remembers, we had a long meeting one night. We were all terribly protective of it. We knew we'd done 3 good ones. I'm not just talking about the writers, the directors, the actors, the crew had stayed with us all the way through. What we basically worried about is, are we going to do something that is going to denigrate what we've done before? I don't think the 4th series was very good. Preston's reservations are striking since one of the best episodes of Season 4 is scripted by him. and that's the show's season 4 premiere, Messenger of the Gods. That's a chase narrative about a series of misunderstandings and mishaps that ensue involving a group of criminals after Regan and Carter bust up a wedding. Episode stars future Law & Order UK star Derek Martin, who also plays a crooked cop in that miniseries, but a soon-to-be married thug. There's a lot of good humor and melodrama in that episode, as well as a decent amount of action, and even Preston was satisfied with the results. He says, "I loved doing Messenger of the Gods because I wanted to change. It was my attempt to not only always do the heavy ones. I got fed up being known as the guy who got people to kick the shit out of each other." I'm also rather partial to the season's 5th episode, Nightmare, which is a bit more action-intensive, to the point where I can't really disagree with the companion's writers when they say that it felt like, quote, a superior installment of The Professionals in places. In the episode, Regan and Carter chase down a bunch of murderous thieves, some of whom are ex-IRA members. The episode gets its title from an unusual dream sequence where Regan's girlfriend dreams that he winds up getting blinded, which, well, you'll see. It's a strong one, albeit also indicative of the way that the show's style was a bit malleable towards the end. Which sounds like a euphemism, but I think you have to really take the good with the bad, and some of the rigidity of the first 3 seasons of the Sweeney is something that I think a lot of fans kind of overlook because they like the same thing over and over again, so it was expected. But that can get a bit tiresome. It's like, oh, some of the episodes kind of blend together. So change is often good in season 4, I think. I also really like the streak of episodes that run from Feet of Clay, which follows a kidnapping plot about a rich ex-criminal whose son is kidnapped, all the way through Jack Regan, the show's series finale, which ends with Regan quitting the flying squad. This last episode is written by producer Ted Childs, who has a writer credit on a couple of other superior season 4 episodes like Latin Lady, the penultimate episode, and Hearts and Minds, which Childs co-wrote with Donald Churchill. Jack Regan is especially strong, however, it's worth a look even if you're not a completist. It was the final episode of the series to be shot, and in some ways feels like Childs' ultimate way of reclaiming a sort of decisive authorship for the series away from original creator Egan Kennedy Martin. In that way, it's arguably the most representative episode in season 4. Speaking about Jack Regan, Childs told Pat Gilbert, quote, "I had a certain proprietary interest in writing it. The property as such was Ian's, though we'd introduced some new characters. I put a lot into it, and John and Dennis seemed to feel that too." Gilbert writes that the episode, which aired on December 28th, 1978, was watched by 13 million viewers. Its concluding scene where Regan quits in a rage was filmed just outside Colette Court, the series' iconic regular shooting location. In this scene, we get a great fiery speech delivered with appropriate fury by John Thaw. He says in character, "I've given the best years of my life to the job. And how does this wonderful police force show its gratitude? It bangs me up in a crabby cell like a cheap villain. And what do you bunch of bleeding, double-dyed hypocrites want me to do now? You want me to crawl back to work and be terribly grateful I didn't get nicked for something I didn't do? Well, you can stuff it." You might think this is the last word on the show, or on it in the show, but Haskins, the show's Garfield Morgan's fussy superintendent, gets one great last lick in. He says, talking about Regan, he'll be back. He needs the job like an alcoholic needs booze. Now let's get back to Sweeney 2, which is knee-deep in a rather intense siege. The bloody intensity of this scene's anticlimactic conclusion is, as stated earlier, one of the reasons why EMI and Houston were initially able to secure an AA certificate, because the violence here is moral and does have consequences that are not ultimately rather glamorous. That concept of moral violence is a bit hard to swallow to my mind, but it's a common one. I mean, think of that phrase that the BPFC used, aversive realism. That concept's a common one when it comes to representations of gore on film, though, when it comes to censorship. There's some silver lining that can be tacked on, and especially argued by a film's well-established producers and distributors, then it's okay as far as gore and explicit violence go. Brian De Palma's Scarface escaped an X rating from the MPAA for similar reasons, because the violence in that film was ultimately deemed realistic enough, and to ultimately have some sort of educational value, aversive realism, using the testimony of real Miami cops to testify to the film's realism. De Palma told me that after he put everything back into the film, they were considering cutting. He basically, he did a couple of tentative cuts, but then he just stuffed it all back in, and he got away with it, apparently. I feel like that's the kind of flex that you can only get away with when you have significant industry backing. The violence in Sweeney 2 isn't as extreme, but it did make me think of the idea of moral violence, aversive realism, and how some people can get away with that thinking while others, especially small-time exploiteers and independent filmmakers, can't. Reviewers for this film were generally positive. There was some criticism of the film, too. Variety's review was rather positive, saying that the film was, quote, excellent British cops and robbers stuff. They also commended the filmmakers for, quote, good action, well-spaced and paced, good characterization, played with finesse, a witty script and stylish direction, all in the production a degree of distinction. The reviewer adds that, quote, Thesping is good to excellent. John Thaw is credible and appealing as the hard-bitten cop who leads the police team on the case. Also notably fine are Denham Elliott as a corrupt police officer who lands in the jug, Dennis Waterman as Thaw's number 2, and Georgina Hale as a pickup promoted by the unattached Thaw. TV Guide's review is also noteworthy. They write, quote, the plot is far-fetched, but the film, directed with style and humor, is quite engaging. Acting is uniformly good, though some of the British accents might be difficult for American audiences to decipher. The police investigation has a realistic feel to it, a quality rarely found in most modern cop films. Time Out London, however, was not as positive. They said, on TV, the Sweeney usually got its story underway with minimum fuss and allow Regan and Carter to carry the show, but here Regan is at his most avuncular and long-suffering as he tackles a bunch of violent bank robbers and a would-be league of gentlemen operating out of Malta. Unfortunately, the filmmakers, many of the TV team, can bring little pictorial or thematic depth to the big screen, opting for easy laughs, slick action, and larger filler sections which develop neither plot nor character. Contemporary reviews of the film, or let me rephrase that. Reviews of the film that are more recent, some from as recent as January 2019, are mostly positive, which suggests that fear of the show's dated qualities are a bit, I mean, they're not wrong, but still. I especially like Samuel Payne's piece for Entertainment Focus, where he writes that, quote, Sweeney 2 is the best of the two movies and a fine film in its own right. A brilliantly crafted collection of action set pieces punctuates sparkling, fierce dialogue between Waterman and Thaw, whose dynamic is now brought up close and in center. Series director Tom Clegg secures some impressive visuals, cross-cutting between London and Malta, to furnish the movie with an expansive scope. Action is executed with a number of car chases and rapidly edited shootouts, which still stand up today. A particularly well-placed sequence of a robbery with a kid on a skateboard, oh my god, the skateboard, offers all of the cinematic tension of a Hitchcock thriller. Whilst the violence has been dialed down, the benefit of a robust narrative with real character development provides an ultimately greater impact for an explosive finale. The whole thing is also polished off with a haunting score from legendary composer Tony Hatch, transcending jazz with some bombastic, sleazy disco, which I think is mostly pretty fair and accurate. And speaking of gore, if you missed gore, here's some. Aversive realism at work, folks. Crime. It doesn't pay. Now we get the aftermath of the siege. It's the most affecting moment in the film and one of the most moving scenes in the show's history, to my mind. say what you want about the show's politics, and there is, as I have said there's a lot to be said, but the human-scaled character drama is at its best here. These characters are human. This one thing that I like most about this movie. In the first 2 seasons, it's often to overlook Regan's humanity, since he's often proven right and is therefore mostly defined by his rules, schmools, bluster. But it's nice to be reminded that he's just a cop, just a working-class guy, human, fallible, frustrated, hurt, humbled, just, just a couple hard days away from cracking up. But as I keep overstressing, it's the job. It's the job that he does, and that's, he is committed to doing it.
What happened to White?
And I think that's why the show has remained so popular, because there is that kind of admiration for working class stiffs who just, they do it day in and day out. They're basically like the unglamorous commuter version of the police, and people respond to that. They see themselves in that, even if that obviously has propagandistic value as well. For some reason, I'm thinking of the siege from that Oliver Reed snake movie, Venom, when I see that street, but oh well. Now we get the reading of the will and the final pump on the blaggers' brakes. Not even their wives and children will ever respect their final wishes. Their legacies are pretty much up in smoke. Because, well, life goes on without them, too.
Structure on this island which will survive.
It's not just the job. Life is just relentless here, and that kind of pessimism is, I think, what gives the film a hard edge, and
the following question.
Gives it staying power.
Do you wish to liquidate your property? That is, sell it. Or to allow it...
The espresso is wearing off. I bet you can tell.
In this document.
Sell. 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 Sell.
Finally, Regan tries one more time to score with Switchboard Susan. Director Tom Clegg claims that actress Georgina Hill used to know some of the old East End characters, according to an interview with Pat Gilbert. Clegg's that she, quote, was part of that Joan Littlewood set at the Pioneering Theatre Workshop based at the Theatre Royal Stratford East and was perfect for the part. She told me this story about going to the Churchill Club near Bond Street where the cigarette girls in their short skirts would drop their fags under the table and give someone a blowjob while they ate their dinner. So that quote paints a picture for sure. I like how even before Regan gets some of his pent-up blue ball energy out by dancing, you can see him sort of trying to make sport of his wounded pride by, wiggling his eyebrows and exaggerated going through his little black book. Thaw plays the pitch of this scene just right, in my opinion.
Retrieval service, I want you.
Look, why don't you phone tomorrow? Anytime, I'll be here all day.
Let me see him going through the black book. Yeah, look at that outfit, man. I wish I could have that outfit. Look at that pub. I mean, come on. Who doesn't want to hang out there? the blokish swagger that we're often commenting on here is never more apparent than in a... Oh, God, those glasses. That beer. It looks so good! I want some Young's Bitter. I want some Young's Bitter.
Yeah, she is, but I think I might blow her up and get hold of the barman. Soon the foot's on it.
Hey, George, come on!
Yeah, come on.
Oh, Bob Soames. Not a suit I would dance in, to be honest, but I'm sure once you got into the end of a day like that, that doesn't really matter. Oh, Carter, you wag. And here she is, Georgina Hale, which leads to one of the great endings to any Sweeney narrative.
Look who's here.
Oh, John Thaw, you lovable man, you. Okay, so this ending is great because, of course, you see the guy dancing around in his underpants. But I love that the zoom in on Regan's face, Thaw's face, it just zooms in, so it crops in so they could crop out the overweight guy dancing around in his underpants. And then the black and white, which is just that much more like, this is serious. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. If you liked it, I recommend checking out the first film as well. It's different, but that doesn't mean it's much weaker. So, thanks again for joining me. Hope you had a good time.